Union Pacific's legendary 9,000-class locomotives had conquered the American West with their 4-12-2 wheel arrangement and unmatched pulling power. But by the early 1930s, Stalin's Soviet Union looked at American achievements and demanded something greater. Entered the AA-20, a steel colossus with 14 coupled driving wheels, 20-ton axle loading, and engineering ambitions that exceeded anything attempted on rails. Built through a partnership between Soviet designers and Germany's Krupp Works at the Lugansk factory in December 1934, this locomotive promised to revolutionize freight transport across the Soviet Empire. Today, almost no one remembers it. It is forgotten. If this machine was meant to surpass American engineering and pull the heaviest freight trains through the Soviet heartland, how did it spend 25 years sitting motionless at a test facility before being cut apart for scrap? The answer reveals the high-stakes gamble and hidden downfall behind Soviet rail engineering's greatest what-if. Across the vast Soviet railway network of the early 1930s, steam locomotives worked around the clock to move grain, coal, and industrial materials that powered Stalin's first five-year plan. The backbone of this system drew heavily on American designs. Soviet engineers had studied Union Pacific's 9,000-class locomotives, with their 12 coupled driving wheels and powerful compound cylinders. These machines could haul trains across mountain grades and endless steppes where lesser engines struggled. Soviet designers built their own versions, adapting American innovations to Russian gauge track and operating conditions. But the Soviet leadership saw these locomotives as merely adequate, not exceptional. Stalin's regime demanded records, superlatives, and achievements that would prove socialist engineering could eclipse capitalist accomplishments. But by the early 1930s, the age of borrowed American designs showed its cracks. Soviet railways struggled under impossible demands. Five-year plan quotas required moving twice the freight with the same worn-out infrastructure. Every locomotive demanded an army of workers. Firemen shoveled tons of coal per shift. Engineers and mechanics worked brutal hours, keeping aging machines operational. Water stops dotted every major route, and coal supplies strained under military and industrial priorities. Maintenance facilities overflowed with locomotives waiting for parts that might take months to arrive from distant factories. Operating costs climbed as the Railway Administration expanded its workforce to meet transportation targets. A single heavy freight locomotive consumed 12 to 15 tons of coal on a typical run between major cities. Crew rosters ballooned, and the railway system's budget sagged under the weight of Stalin's endless demands for more tonnage, faster delivery, and visible proof of socialist superiority. Meanwhile, limited experiments with diesel locomotives emerged from Soviet design bureaus and foreign imports. These machines promised reduced fuel consumption and simpler maintenance. They needed fewer crew members and could theoretically run longer distances between servicing. Yet early Soviet diesel locomotives struggled with reliability. They lacked the raw muscle needed for heavy freight on grades, and their technology remained unproven on the massive scale Soviet operations required. Inside the commissariat offices in Moscow, the numbers told a hard truth. Scheme's dominance would continue, but something had to change. The People's Commissariat for Transportation faced a crossroads. Continue pouring resources into incremental improvements of proven American designs, or gamble on something entirely new? The stakes weren't just about horsepower, but the survival of a railway system choking on its own success. Stalin's regime demanded visible achievements that could be trumpeted in propaganda. The search for a true replacement began, not just for a locomotive, but for a symbol that Soviet engineering could exceed anything the capitalist world produced. Lazar Kaganovich, Stalin's ruthless commissar for transportation, was not content to follow foreign examples. He saw the Soviet railway's future in bold, sweeping terms: where a single locomotive could shatter records and pull freight loads that would make American engineers jealous. In the early 1930s, Soviet railway administrators approached Germany's Krupp works with a radical proposal. The German company had expertise in heavy machinery and complex steam locomotive construction. Together with Soviet designers at the Lugansk works in Ukraine, they would create something unprecedented: a locomotive with more coupled driving wheels than any machine ever built. Not 10 wheels like some European designs, not 12 like the American 9000 class, but 14 wheels working in unison to spread weight and generate pulling power that would redefine what railways could accomplish.
The lead Soviet engineer overseeing the project, described the initial concept as nothing less than a revolution on rails. Instead of building bigger boilers or longer fireboxes, the design team would multiply the number of driving wheels to distribute weight and maximize adhesion. Krupp's German engineers started the locomotive as a 2-14-4 wheel arrangement before Soviet designers pushed for an even more ambitious 4-14-4 configuration. The numbers sounded impressive on paper. Initial calculations suggested the locomotive could handle trains weighing over 3,000 tons on level track. But the real ambition went further. By distributing weight across 14 driving axles, engineers believed they could run this behemoth on the Soviet Union's notoriously light rail infrastructure, rated at just 78 pounds per yard, rails that would buckle under concentrated weight from conventional heavy locomotives. The design specifications escalated with each planning session: 20-ton axle loading across all driving wheels, 3 center axles without flanges to navigate curves that would otherwise derail such a long, rigid frame, compound cylinders feeding steam to 14 coupled wheels, each one pushing against the rails with mechanical force that promised to haul anything the Soviet economy could load behind it. This alliance was not just about raw power. Kaganovich and his commissariat wanted a locomotive that could operate on existing light rail without requiring expensive infrastructure upgrades. They wanted something that could silence critics who said Soviet engineering merely copied the West. The AA-20 became that answer, a locomotive so ambitious it would carry the world record for coupled driving wheels, a title it would hold forever. Soviet propaganda organs wasted no time painting the AA-20 as the locomotive of the socialist future. Technical journals published by the Railway Ministry gleamed with detailed drawings and performance projections. Headlines proclaimed Bolshevik innovation had exceeded American capitalist designs. The language of the era dripped with revolutionary fervor. Official announcements declared the AA-20 represented the first true product of scientific socialist engineering, built to serve the workers and fulfill 5-year plan quotas without capitalist profit motives distorting design decisions. Factory newspapers at Lugansk carried daily updates as workers assembled the massive frame. Photographs showed rows of driving wheels waiting for installation, each one a testament to Soviet industrial capacity. The message was clear. While capitalist countries built locomotives to maximize railroad company profits, Soviet engineers built machines to serve the people. Technical specifications appeared in every publication that covered transportation. The 4-14-4 wheel arrangement became a symbol of Soviet ambition, a configuration so complex that no Western railway would dare attempt it. Pravda and Izvestia ran features comparing the AA-20's specifications to Union Pacific's finest locomotives, claiming the Soviet machine exceeded American achievements in every meaningful category. Editorial cartoons showed the AA-20 towering over smaller Western locomotives, pulling endless trains of grain and steel toward a glorious socialist future. The coverage reached its peak when official photographers documented the locomotive's completion ceremony at Lugansk in December 1934, with workers posing beside driving wheels taller than a man and a boiler that stretched the length of several railway cars. Technical literature from the period boasted that the AA-20 could deliver unprecedented tractive effort while operating on infrastructure that American railroads would consider inadequate for heavy freight. Fact sheets distributed to railway administrators touted the 20-ton per axle loading as a breakthrough that would allow the Soviet Union to move massive freight volumes without rebuilding thousands of miles of track. The economic implications seemed revolutionary. Instead of spending years and millions of rubles upgrading rail lines, the Soviet railway system could simply deploy locomotives engineered to work within existing limitations. Railway commissariat officials echoed this optimism in meetings and public addresses. Statements promised that locomotives like the AA-20 could replace multiple smaller engines with a single unit, concentrating power and reducing the crew requirements that strained labor resources. The word transformative appeared in nearly every official document. In Moscow, Kaganovich hosted demonstrations for Communist Party officials and foreign technical delegations eager to showcase Soviet engineering prowess. Journalists from worker newspapers attended presentations where engineers unveiled technical drawings and scale models of the massive machine. The hype reached its crescendo in January 1935 when the AA-20 departed Lugansk for its inaugural journey to Moscow. Railway workers lined the tracks to witness the spectacle. Local party officials organized celebrations at stations along the route. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the future of Soviet railways really had arrived on 14 driving wheels, ready to fulfill every promise the propaganda machine had made. On a cold January morning in 1935, the AA-20 rolled out of the Lugansk factory gates for its publicity journey to Moscow. Railway officials and factory workers watched as the locomotive's massive frame filled their field of vision, its 14 coupled wheels creating a rhythmic pattern of steel against steel that no one had ever heard before. The sound was unlike any locomotive in Soviet service, a deep, almost grinding pulse, as the unprecedented wheel arrangement fought to coordinate power delivery across such an extreme length. Newspaper photographers positioned themselves trackside to capture the machine in motion, documenting what they believed would be the first of many historic runs. Initial reports filed by railway inspectors traveling with the locomotive noted impressive statistics. The AA-20 moved its test train out of Lugansk, pulling a load heavier than standard freight locomotives typically handled. Engineers in the cab reported smooth throttle response and adequate steam pressure as the locomotive navigated the relatively flat approaches toward the Moscow main line. For several miles, everything appeared to validate the design team's calculations. The distributed weight across 14 axles seemed to work exactly as planned. Track crews watching from maintenance stations saw a locomotive that looked every bit the revolutionary machine propaganda had promised. But behind the excitement, the first hints of trouble appeared in the track inspection reports. At the first major junction, railway workers noticed something alarming. The AA-20's passage had visibly spread the track gauge. Rails that should have maintained precise spacing now sat millimeters wider apart, pushed outward by forces the track bed couldn't contain. The flangeless center wheels, designed to help the locomotive navigate curves, were creating lateral pressure that light Soviet rails simply couldn't resist. Track gang supervisors measured the displacement and filed urgent reports to regional maintenance offices. Where the AA-20 had passed, the gauge had widened by up to 15 millimeters in some sections. The problems compounded at every switch and junction. Railway points, the mechanical assemblies that route trains between tracks, suffered catastrophic damage. The AA-20's extreme length and rigid wheelbase created forces that exceeded design tolerances. Switch mechanisms bent and jammed after the locomotive passed. Signal maintainers discovered cracked tie plates and displaced rails at multiple locations along the route. What should have been a triumphant journey became a trail of infrastructure damage, visible to any track worker paying attention. Crews traveling with the locomotive faced mounting challenges as the run progressed. The AA-20's couplings, designed to connect it to freight cars, proved inadequate for the forces involved. The locomotive's theoretical pulling power far exceeded what standard Soviet railway couplers could safely transmit. Engineers had to reduce throttle settings and limit the locomotive's performance to avoid damaging the train behind it. The machine built to exceed American achievements couldn't even operate at its designed capacity without ripping itself apart from its own freight consist.
By the time the AA-20 reached Moscow's outskirts, railway officials confronting the damage reports understood they had a disaster on their hands. The locomotive was too powerful for Soviet couplings, too long for existing turntables, and too destructive for the light rail infrastructure it was supposedly designed to accommodate. The excitement of January's publicity run gave way to grim calculations about repair costs and the growing dread that 25 years of Soviet railway planning had produced a 400-ton engineering catastrophe. For the workers who had built the AA-20 with such pride, the reality was beginning to settle in. Their revolutionary locomotive couldn't safely operate anywhere on the Soviet railway network. Inside the maintenance facilities at Moscow's railway depot, the AA-20's problems became impossible to ignore. Track maintenance crews filed reports documenting the extent of damage along the locomotive's route from Lugansk. Every major junction required immediate repairs. Gangs worked around the clock replacing bent rails and rebuilding switch mechanisms the AA-20 had wrecked during its single publicity run. The costs mounted with each repair requisition, and railway administrators faced a harsh reality. This locomotive destroyed infrastructure faster than maintenance crews could repair it. Engineers attempted to diagnose the fundamental flaws. The 14-wheel arrangement, so impressive on paper, created a rigid frame that generated destructive forces through curves and track irregularities. The flangeless center wheels, meant to provide flexibility, instead pushed laterally against rails with such force that light tracks simply surrendered. On curves, the locomotive's wheelbase fought against the geometry of the turn, transferring enormous stress into rails, ties, and roadbed. Track that had survived decades of normal traffic couldn't withstand a single passage of the AA-20 without measurable damage. Attempts to operate the locomotive on Soviet railways revealed more catastrophic flaws. The AA-20 couldn't navigate the turntables at major railway facilities. Its extreme length exceeded the diameter of turning equipment designed for conventional locomotives. This meant the machine could only operate in one direction on many routes, requiring complex switching maneuvers or dedicated Y tracks to reverse direction. Railway operations planners discovered their revolutionary locomotive couldn't integrate into existing traffic patterns without massive infrastructure investments. Derailments became routine. Almost every movement attempt resulted in wheels lifting off rails or the locomotive binding in curves it theoretically should have navigated. The three flangeless center axles created unpredictable behavior. Sometimes the locomotive tracked smoothly. Other times it would suddenly lurch sideways, stressing couplings and terrifying crews. Workers who operated the AA-20 during test movements described it as fundamentally unsafe. The machine felt unstable even at low speeds. The cab shook and twisted as the wheel arrangement fought against itself. Parts and repairs became an endless cycle of failure. The extreme forces destroyed bearings and axle journals at rates that made maintenance impossible. Where a conventional locomotive might run weeks between bearing inspections, the AA-20 required daily examination of its 14 driving axles. Each inspection revealed new cracks, worn surfaces, and stress damage. Supply chains couldn't keep pace with the consumption of replacement parts. The locomotive would sit idle for days or weeks, waiting for bearings, springs, or wheel components that had to be specially manufactured.
Crews assigned to the AA-20 developed their own nickname for the machine, though none dared speak it in official reports. They called it the track wrecker, a grim acknowledgement of the destruction it left behind. Shop workers who had initially taken pride in building such an ambitious locomotive now viewed it with frustration and embarrassment. The ratio between operational time and maintenance time became absurd. For every hour the AA-20 moved under its own power, dozens of hours went into repairs, damage assessment, and track reconstruction. The dream of a low-maintenance, high-power future faded under the harsh lights of the Moscow depot. Railway reliability wasn't measured in theoretical tractive effort or revolutionary wheel arrangements, but in how many locomotives could actually answer the call each morning. By mid-1935, the answer for the AA-20 was clear: almost never. Along the routes where the AA-20 had operated, the destruction became visible testimony to the locomotive's failure. Track workers pointed out sections of rail permanently damaged by the machine's passage. Small towns near railway junctions complained about the constant repair work that disrupted schedules and blocked crossing gates for hours while crews rebuilt switches.
Local railway officials filed protests with regional administrators, demanding that the experimental locomotive never operate through their districts again. The public backlash, though carefully managed by state censors, created political pressure that even Kadanovich couldn't ignore entirely. Meanwhile, conventional steam locomotives and early diesel designs quietly proved their worth across the Soviet railway network. While engineers struggled with the AA-20's impossible demands, standard freight locomotives moved tonnage day after day with predictable maintenance needs and operational patterns. The comparison became impossible to ignore. A fleet of proven locomotives could haul more freight, more reliably, and at lower total cost than a single experimental giant that spent more time in the shop than on the rails. Diesel locomotives, though still relatively rare in the Soviet Union, offered flexibility the AA-20 could never match. They operated on routes the experimental machine couldn't navigate, handled a variety of freight and passenger service, and required maintenance that railway workshops already understood. The economic reality appeared in the Transportation Commissariat's monthly ledgers. Every ruble spent maintaining the AA-20 and repairing its damage was a ruble unavailable for expanding the reliable locomotive fleet the Soviet economy desperately needed. The difference was clear in the operational reports. While the AA-20 sat idle at test facilities, conventional locomotives powered the grain shipments, coal trains, and industrial freight that kept Stalin's 5-year plans moving forward. Soviet engineers had gambled on revolutionary innovation and lost to the quiet, proven reliability of conventional technology. By early 1935, reality forced a decision that no propaganda campaign could delay. Internal memos from the People's Commissariat for Transportation documented the catastrophic cost of the AA-20 project. Track damage alone had consumed resources equivalent to building several conventional locomotives. The experimental machine had proven it couldn't operate safely on Soviet rails, couldn't integrate into existing facilities, and couldn't fulfill any meaningful transportation role. On a date that never appeared in public announcements, Kaganovich's office issued a directive. The AA-20 would be removed from active testing and stored at the Shcherbinka experimental facility outside Moscow. The order was blunt and bureaucratic. No more test runs would be authorized. No further resources would be allocated to solving the locomotive's fundamental design flaws. The machine that was supposed to exceed American engineering and revolutionize Soviet freight transport would sit silent under a corrugated roof, a monument to ambition that exceeded practical limits. Railway officials who had championed the project avoided mentioning it in reports. The AA-20 vanished from official publications and planning documents as if it had never existed. For 25 years, the locomotive sat motionless at Shcherbinka. Rust claimed its once gleaming boiler jacket, weather-degraded components never designed for decades of exposure. Occasionally, railway engineering students or foreign delegations on carefully managed tours would glimpse the machine, though minimal explanation of its history was offered. The world record holder for coupled driving wheels became a forgotten curiosity, too embarrassing to display prominently, too expensive to scrap immediately, too politically sensitive to discuss openly. In 1960, with Stalin long dead and Soviet railways fully committed to diesel and electric traction, salvage crews finally arrived at Shcherbinka. They came with cutting torches and heavy equipment, working methodically to dismantle the AA-20. Steel and metal components were sorted and sold for scrap value. The 14 driving wheels, each one a testament to impossible ambition, were separated and melted down. The boiler was cut apart, the frame was reduced to manageable pieces and hauled away. There was no preservation campaign, no commemorative plaque, no final acknowledgement of the locomotive's place in railway history. The AA-20 story ended not with ceremony, but with the harsh economics of scrap value exceeding storage costs. Unlike American locomotives preserved in museums and celebrated in enthusiast publications, the AA-20 left almost no physical trace of its existence. Soviet railway museums never sought to save it. The machine represented failure, not achievement, an experiment that proved ideology and ambition couldn't overcome engineering reality. Today, as railways worldwide chase new forms of power from hydrogen fuel cells to autonomous operation systems, the lesson endures.
Innovation only works when technology meets real-world demands. The AA-20's fate warns that bold promises and revolutionary designs can vanish completely when confronted by the unforgiving realities of physics, economics, and practical operation. In every industry, the next big thing is always just one test away from being forgotten, one failed promise away from the cutting torch and scrapyard. What do you think? Are we repeating history or finally learning from it?